Hey everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ and Friends. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and my guest today is none other than the plant-based cardiologist, Dr. Andrew Freeman. He's been on the show before. He does an amazing talk every year, changing the year, not the name of the talk. It's called The Year in Plants, and because this is 2025, the talk is called The Year in Plants 2025. Please welcome him back to the show. Every time I see you, you look younger, and I'm not just saying that. You look
You're
like you're in
too
college.
kind.
No, I mean you just look so young. So you must be doing something right.
Eating plants and living well. That's the plan.
Nice.
Well, I'm so happy to be here again. And every year, for those of you who haven't seen me give this talk, I try to comb through the literature and sort of update us on where we're going, how the stats look, and of course, the latest in nutrition science, which many of us sadly miss because they're scattered through a variety of journals and don't get the same media attention as some of the more sexy medications and procedures. So just a quick notice, of course, there are many well-done randomized trials showing the efficacy of plant-based diets. Some studies are observational, don't show cause, but show significant relationships. And I show this slide every single year because every single year I get lots and lots and lots of questions. The truth is that no matter where you go, if you eat plants, you're going to get plenty of protein. And pound for pound, spinach, kale, and broccoli have more protein than the usual beef, chicken, etc. And one of the things that irks me the most is when docs say, "Oh, you better eat your meat to get your whatever." Remember, we knew back then, even when Popeye was a cartoon, right, that spinach was the thing that made people strong. So let's jump into some of the stats. I'm always so floored at how terribly we're doing, but it turns out that American Heart Association predicts about 61% of US adults will be diagnosed with some type of cardiovascular disease by 2050, mostly attributed to high blood pressure, an aging population, and increasing population diversity. One thing I'll point out that a lot of people don't realize is hypertension is so very prevalent and an unbelievable exponential risk for cardiovascular disease. So for every 20 points, roughly, you go above 120, the risk for a cardiac event roughly doubles. So it's mind-blowingly exponential and risky. And it's going to cost the US around 2 trillion in direct healthcare costs, productivity losses by 2050. Diabetes is going to jump to about 27%, and obesity is going to be the majority. So if you are thin, you will be in the minority coming soon. And if you look at some of the health behaviors that predict bad outcomes, smoking, inadequate physical activity, inadequate sleep, and poor diet, guess which one tops the list? The red, poor diet. And even in children, if you look, obesity is on the rise. We're talking more than 30% of obesity in children. And we know that health behaviors,
Dr. Freeman, I'm not
yep,
seeing your slides anymore.
you're not.
No, maybe
Uh,
it's just me, but I saw the first one, guys. Are you seeing his slides or is it something on my end? I stopped seeing them after the first slide.
well, let me reshare.
Yeah. Let's see if the audience, they're definitely there right now.
Okay, you can see them now.
Yeah,
Okay,
it starts with
so
children.
all
Yeah,
right, well, I'll
thank
go
you.
back then. So I showed this slide about the protein, talking about the stats, US adults, diet still tops the behaviors, and then in children. And as you can see, children here, 30% or more by 2050. And you can see that all of the dietary risks, that's the yellow line on that right curve, is also quite prevalent. And if that's not enough, more and more Americans are developing fatty liver, or some people will call it non-alcoholic steatohepatitis or metabolic associated steatic liver disease. But all these different terms that basically are saying fatty liver. And the reason why fatty liver matters is that is the sort of herald of metabolic dysfunction, including diabetes and heart disease. So as more and more people eat more and more poorly and don't move as much, more and more get fatty liver and then bad outcomes. And then if you look at this interesting study that came out of Tianjin, they looked at about 1,137 adults and then also 170,000 out of the UK Biobank. And it turns out that if you ate the Eat Lancet diet, which for those of you unfamiliar is a predominantly plant-based diet that was proposed by the Lancet Journal, which is one of the big medical journals in Europe. And it turns out that if you eat better, you had a third less fatty liver, which therefore means better outcomes overall. And now another interesting study, and this was 5,000 women from the New York University Women's Health Study. If you follow the DASH diet, that's the Dietary Approaches to Stopping Hypertension diet, which is a predominantly plant-based diet, 17% more cognitive complaints versus women in the top quartile, meaning if you eat better, less cognitive complaints. And the authors concluded that greater adherence to this diet in midlife was associated with lower prevalence of late life subjective cognitive complaints, meaning memories stay intact. And speaking of, you may know my good friend Dean Ornish has been doing lots of really nifty work with Alzheimer's progression. This was an interesting small study of 51 Alzheimer's disease patients, and they looked at them when they were enrolled in a comprehensive lifestyle change program. And it turns out that people significantly improved in the group participants, and those who adhered most consistently to the diet had the best benefits. Meanwhile, the vast majority of those who made no changes actually had worsened cognitive functioning. So I always tell people it's never too late to make these changes, provided that you can implement them right away. This was another interesting study then, and again, a lot of these studies over the years use the nurses' health study and the health professionals follow-up study. It's a great cohort where they have lots of dietary information, and they looked at olive oil intake assessed every 4 years. They looked at a huge quantity of participants, 100,000 almost. And if you consume at least 7 grams a day, with 28, you had 28% lower risk of dementia-related death compared to never or rarely consuming it. That's about a half a tablespoon. And the results, interestingly, were similar even for those who have ApoE, which is a genetic predisposition for earlier dementia or Alzheimer's dementia. And if you're able to replace 5 grams a day of margarine and mayonnaise with the equivalent amount of olive oil, you actually died much less from lower risk of mortality from dementia. So pretty amazing. Now, ultra-processed foods, as you may know, are on the rise, and it's kind of flooring. I mean, pretty much anywhere you go right now, everything is ultra-processed. And especially as you go to parts of our country that are lower socioeconomic status, the corner stores that are around, the mom and pop grocery stores are just filled with processed snack foods that are just, shelf stable. And what I always tell people is the longer the shelf life, the shorter their life. And in this particular interesting study of about 250,000 patients that were free of disease, they looked at their baseline food frequency questionnaire and then followed them for 11 years. Higher ultra-processed food consumption for each 1 standard deviation increment, which is about 260 grams a day without alcohol, had 9% more risk of multimorbidity and cancer and cardiometabolic diseases. So imagine if you're eating just ultra-processed foods, lots of people are, imagine what kind of risk you're putting yourself through. This was an interesting study, female registered nurses from 11 US states, and then male health professionals from all 50 states, 74,000 women, 39,000 men. And if you were in the highest quartile of consumption of ultra-processed food, you had 4% higher all-cause mortality and 9% higher mortality from causes other than cancer or cardiovascular disease. And if you had processed meat, up to 43% more death, sugar-sweetened, artificially sweetened beverages, up to 12% more death, dairy-based desserts, 10% more death, and ultra-processed breakfast food, up to 7% more death. And as you may have seen me give talks in the years past, those patients who are consuming sweetened beverages with sugar or artificially sweetened beverages are putting themselves in all sorts of risk and jeopardy. This was 201,000 participants free of baseline atrial fibrillation followed for 10 years. When you compare with consumers, individuals who consume 2 liters a week of a sugar-sweetened beverage or an artificially sweetened beverage had an increased risk of atrial fibrillation up to 20% more. And the highest hazard ratios of atrial fibrillation were observed for patients who had genetic risk. So if you're unlucky enough to have a gene that predisposes you to atrial fibrillation and you consume 2 liters a week of soda, 351% more atrial fibrillation. And then we also know that artificial sweeteners disrupt the gut microbiome. And this was an interesting study that looked at the duodenoluminal microbiome. And it looked like that when people were consuming these sweeteners, they shifted their diversity of flora to a decreased level, meaning only certain bugs can survive in this chemical mixture. And findings suggest that consuming non-sugar sweeteners alters this composition and function, which also alters the stool. And we know that the microbiome is a major untapped frontier for human health. So for those of you who haven't seen this, it's pretty amazing. And there was a whole thing on Netflix, if you haven't seen it, on twins. But I guess if you're going to really want to study the effect of diet, you might as well study people who are genetically identical. And in this study, they took 22 pairs of twins, 44 people, and they randomized people to a vegan or an omnivorous diet, 1 twin per diet, obviously. And they randomized to follow a healthy vegan diet or a healthy omnivorous diet for 8 weeks. In weeks 0 to 4, they got the meals. In weeks 5 to 8, they prepare their own meals. And interestingly, those who followed the vegan diet dropped their LDL by 14 points, their insulin level, and their body weight by about 5 pounds. These are genetically identical people. So if you take genetic identical people and you put them on a better diet, they do better, and literally in just 8 weeks. Mind blowing, right? So as many of you know, I work at National Jewish Health, it's a big respiratory hospital. People are always surprised to learn that COPD and asthma and all these diseases respond quite favorably to lifestyle modification. And so participants in the cardio study, and these are younger people, 18 to 30, and then followed for 30 years, they looked at people who were current or former smokers at year 20, and they looked at their diet. And it turns out that greater adherence to a plant-centered diet was inversely associated with emphysema, which is a roughly 66% risk reduction. Remember, inflammation is the root cause for every single disease. And when we can live in an anti-inflammatory environment, we can often heal ourselves. Many people have seen me talk about coffee in the past. Remember, coffee in itself is usually quite healthful unless you don't drink it habitually or you add unbelievable amounts of sweeteners and cream and whatnot to it. But this interesting study looked at about nearly 432,000 patients, and coffee drinkers of any intake had a reduced likelihood of developing irritable bowel syndrome by 16%. So as I mentioned earlier, blood pressure is an exponential risk factor, and it turns out that if you look in rural places where there are less doctors, they randomly assigned 163 villages to a non-physician community healthcare provider-led intervention, and then 163 villages to quote-unquote usual care. And they took this non-physician and trained them on how to sort of manage blood pressure and follow an algorithm. And it turns out that when you touch people more frequently and you care about them and you counsel them, and you adjust medications, you can get a blood pressure drop of 22 points, which is pretty darn amazing and markedly improves outcomes. But it also turns out that by doing that, dementia also significantly dropped. And I'm sure if they measured long enough, all of the cardiovascular diseases would improve. Now imagine if they had done this and combined it with an incredible lifestyle approach. And so what I want to point out is the more you are able to engage with patients, the more advanced you are with adjusting lifestyle parameters and medications to lower blood pressure, people do so much better. You don't even need to be a physician to do these things. So this was a really interesting study. So if you look at Life's Essential 8, which is what the American Heart Association puts out for how to live well, and you looked at 6,500 adults who were put and measured how well they were adhering to this, it turns out that adults with high cardiovascular health were roughly about 6 years younger biologically than their chronologic age. And even though Chef AJ always jokes with me, I wonder, if I had not been following a plant-based diet, if I'd be subject to all of my genetic destiny. So who knows? Now, this is interesting. So many of you who've been around for a while may have heard of the portfolio diet, which was one of the very first plant-based diets. And in this larger study, again, Nurses Health Study 2 and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, they did a PDS, a portfolio diet score, to see how well people were eating this diet. And they followed people for 30 years. And it turns out that when you look at the highest versus the lowest quintile, they divided them into 5. It turns out that when you had the highest score, you had a lower risk of total cardiovascular disease by 14%, coronary heart disease by 14%, stroke by 14%. Whereas if you had a 25% higher portfolio diet score, you had 8% lower risk. So in general, even if you're not at the top, the more you can do, the better the outcome. So this was great. Dr. Hu does lots of great work, and he published a study in the Journal of Internal Medicine about diet strategies for promoting healthy aging and longevity, which is a hot topic these days, right? People want to live longer and feel better. And of course, what is it? It's one of the very many plant-based diets out there, whether it's Okinawa or the Planetary Health or the Nordic or Mediterranean, whatever it is, the more you can do, the better. So this is also an interesting study that looked now into the metabolomic picture. So they looked at biomarkers and blood tests and all that. And it turns out that when people had a healthy metabolomic signature, they actually had up to 25% more likelihood to reach longevity, 19% for cardiovascular disease reduction, et cetera. And the healthy lifestyle explained about 38% of the association between self-reported healthy lifestyle and mortality risk, and almost half of the association with longevity. So yes, we are all subject to our genes, but the environment we put our genes in has a significant impact on how we do. And of course, if you look deeper into the study here, healthy diet, physical activity, never smoking, moderate alcohol, normal body mass index, and you look at all the different metabolites that could be measured, you can find out just by drawing blood who, quote unquote, is living healthier. And they define longevity in the study as people who got to 85. So more and more work is coming out about how red meat is more and more dangerous. This was another study that shows that comparing highest to lowest quintiles of intake, 62% more diabetes, 51% for processed meat, 40% for unprocessed meat. And if you can substitute 1 serving a day of nuts and legumes for total red meat, 30% less diabetes. For processed meat, 41% less diabetes. And for unprocessed red meat, 29% less diabetes. So I don't know what it's going to take to put a warning label on meats, but I would wish they would just do it. And it turns out that there are more and more enlightened medical professionals all over the country and in different specialties. This is a GI doc, and it just came across my reading list. And she was talking about how, when people are not doing well from a GI perspective, when they change their diet, they do better. Now, you may have seen this out of the American Heart Association, food is medicine. And, let me put out there that food is medicine or food as medicine or whichever flavor you take, it's been around for a long time, but it's finally getting the attention of politicians and professional societies. And it's nice to see that they are focusing on, emphasizing fruits and vegetables and getting rid of the stuff that we know is bad. So interestingly, I was surprised to see this, but even in the UK, which tends to be somewhat resistant to dietary modification, Brits are increasingly opting for plant-based alternatives, says the title. And people in the UK are consuming the lowest amount of meat since records began in 1974. Government data has revealed the average quantity of meat an average Brit consumed dropped, which was pretty great. Many people are surprised to learn that erectile dysfunction is something that we talk about regularly in a cardiology clinic, but it turns out it's the canary in the coal mine, meaning it shows up before people typically have cardiac events. So in this interesting study here of 11 randomized controlled trials, it turns out that if you are able to be physically active, because diet alone is not all that we need to do, you actually can have significant improvement in erectile function. We also know that prostate cancer, and I've talked about this a lot in the past, is highly associated with diet. In this interesting study of 3,500 plus participants, a higher plant-based index was associated with better scores for sexual function, urinary bladder obstruction, etc. Also associated with better sexual and bowel function, also important during the prostate cancer disease state. So this was a super interesting article that came out in Nature. Nature, as you may know, is one of the big science-y journals. And what they said is they described a threshold effect of high protein intake and circulating leucine on monocytes or macrophages, which are part of the immune system. And it turns out that if you're eating in excess of 25 grams of protein per meal, it induces this mTOR activation. And there is an issue that in mouse models, protein of excess in about 22% of dietary energy drives atherosclerosis. So it turns out that if you eat unbelievable amounts of protein, like many people are, Americans are incredibly protein obsessed these days. Besides the effect on cancer, which I've talked about previously, it looks like that there's probably a significant effect on atherosclerosis, which is that's the stuff that's behind heart disease. Pretty amazing. Another interesting study of dementia. This was 754 people who passed away. The mean age of death was 91. Lifestyle and demographic factors were collected at regular intervals. And for each 1 point increase in the healthy lifestyle score, they had fewer units of beta amyloid, which is what we look for when people have Alzheimer's disease, and lifestyle benefit, even if there was already evidence of brain pathology. So they suggest that greater than 88% of a person's cognitive brain function was directly associated with lifestyle factors, leaving less than 12% related to the presence of dementia-related brain pathology. Pretty mind-blowing. So this is interesting. So a lot of people are worried about the elderly, and they say that, if you are eating a plant-based diet and you're elderly, you're just going to be malnourished. So they looked at 2 Spanish cohorts, and it turns out that plant protein consumption had a greater protective effect on nutritional status. And every 0.25 grams per kilogram intake of animal protein was associated with better odds of improved nutritional status. But look at the comparison to plant protein. For that very same amount, it was improved nutritional status by 77%. So replacing 0.25 grams per kilogram per day of total animal protein, but not dairy or egg, with vegetable protein was associated with improvements in nutritional status. So bottom line, if you eat plants, no matter how old you are, you can thrive. And a lot of people are surprised to hear about malnutrition because everybody's so big these days. But it turns out that you can be obese and malnourished at the very same time. So pretty mind-blowing. This is another study I mentioned to my patients all the time because I'm always checking them for B12, but if their B levels are too high, it can also be harmful. There was a study some years ago showing a link in men to lung cancer, but in this study here, they suggest that there's an inflammation-dependent mechanism underlying and associated between too much B and major adverse cardiovascular events, meaning heart attacks. So again, vitamins are good if you're not eating well or you're not able to get it from your diet, but don't overdo it. Surprisingly, and probably not to many of you, I mean, I would say that medicine these days is in a very interesting place in our country, but medical debt is at an all-time high. And it turns out that somebody studied it, and it turns out that the stress that it induces actually significantly hurts us. And it turns out that for 20% of the population has medical debt, and for every $100 increase in medical debt, 8 more days of poor physical health and almost 7 days more of poor mental health. And if just 1% of the population has medical debt, 18 more physically unhealthy days, 18 more mentally unhealthy days, and an extra year of life lost for every 1,000 people. So think about that as an emerging problem. So I was fortunate enough to write a great paper with a great group of folks here, and we got to put it in the Mayo Clinical Proceedings about how lifestyle medicine really is pretty magical for cardiometabolic diseases. And of course, we concluded with lifestyle medicine is holding a great promise for a comprehensive and much improved population health, but the adoption at the societal scale requires a multifaceted approach and widespread integration, which would galvanize a paradigm shift to prevent, treat, or reverse chronic diseases from the root causes and also achieve health equity. Many people are surprised to learn that where you live also matters, and it turns out socioeconomic determinants of health are super potent predictors of health outcomes. So this was an interesting study that used AI and machine learning of people undergoing calcium scores that we look for coronary disease. And if you were a person who was able to live in an area that had sidewalks, you were 9% less likely to suffer major cardiac events. And people living in places that scored highly for vertical green space, trees, and clear sky were 5% less likely to suffer these events. So again, the bottom line is Earthlings need a healthy Earth to thrive. Many people are surprised also to learn that, we have all sorts of acoustic capabilities and vibration components, and there may be something really to when we say that somebody gives us good vibes, but music gives rise to a unique physical sensation in the body, and the strongest heart sensations emerge from a sequence with a low surprise in the first 3 chords and high surprise in the final chord that has specific labeling in music theory. This pattern's ability to stir stronger heart sensations was tied to enhanced pleasure. Jumping back to nutrition again, salt is on the rise. And again, it doesn't seem like you can go anywhere these days without enormous amounts of salt. But if you look at this interesting study of 213 individuals, people had a baseline visit consuming their usual diet, and then they had 1 week of 2,200 milligrams of sodium added to their usual diet, and then low sodium, which was 500 milligrams. And compared to the high sodium, the low sodium diet dropped the mean pressure in about 3/4 of the individuals. About 8 millimeters of mercury, and it was similar across subgroups of age, sex, race, hypertension, blood pressure, diabetes, and body mass index. Another interesting study here of people followed for almost 500,000 people followed for 12 years. Those who were reporting sometimes adding salt to their food had 4% more chronic kidney disease. But if you're one of those people who always add salt to food, and we all know people that before they even taste the food are salting it, 11% more chronic kidney disease. And these were all compared to those who rarely or never added salt. This was an interesting study. 48 elderly care centers followed for 2 years, about 300 people in each group. And if you're able to substitute the normal salt, which is normally just sodium chloride, but add in some potassium chloride and some flavorings, the substitute group had 40% less high blood pressure and a net reduction of 8 points systolic, and the salt group increased. No episodes of low blood pressure. And imagine if we had a substitute that had no added salt, how well we could do. Pretty amazing. This is another interesting study of 3,100 people with heart disease. 89% consume more than the recommended daily maximum of 1,500 milligrams of salt. Study participants with cardiovascular disease consumed more than double that, 3,000 milligrams of sodium a day, which is slightly lower than the national average of 3,400 milligrams. We need to do better. Now, for those of you that are still interested in a low-carb diet, it turns out that if you can do it with plants, you'll do yourself a lot better service. 123,000 plus participants were followed. They followed one of 5 diets, a total low-carb diet, an animal-based low-carb diet, a vegetable-based low-carb diet, a healthy low-carb diet, and an unhealthy low-carb diet. And it turns out that if for every 1 standard deviation increase in a very low carbohydrate diet, had less weight gain, and all others gained weight. So if you go low carb, do it with plants. And it turns out there's actually a whole bunch of published resources on this, on vegetables and even some beans that you can eat that are relatively low carb. And then another interesting study of a low carb, high fat diet was defined as less than 100 grams per day, or less than 25% total daily energy from carbohydrates, 45% or more total daily energy from fat. And it turns out that if you follow these people for 12 years, the low carb, high fat diet versus the standard deviation, the standard diet participants experienced a cardiac event, so more than double. And the difference remains significant after adjustment for cardiovascular risk factors. So it was a 218% increased risk if you calculate it out. Now, as I mentioned earlier, inflammation is the root cause for every disease, including things like arthritis, right? All the diseases we talk about that ends in itis are inflamed. And so a population here was followed for 11 years. And it turns out that when you score how well people are doing, it turns out that when people eat better, they actually have much less pain overall. So as an adjunct to arthritis therapies and treatments, consider changing diet. So this was a really interesting one. This was a Mendelian randomization analysis from the UK Biobank, 136,000 participants. And in a multivariable randomization analysis, exposure to elevated LDL or high blood pressure in early in life in people less than 55, 68% more coronary disease per 39 milligram or 39 point cholesterol in our country, and 33% more coronary disease per 10 millimeter increase. So it turns out that we're starting to really understand that our cumulative exposure to high cholesterol, high blood pressure, things that we know are associated with bad outcomes matters the most. And when we have these effects early in life, it affects us later in life. And we know from some of the prior things I've presented that what your mom eats actually matters for your health later in life. Mind-blowing. So this was an interesting one. So this was nearly 3,000 adults, and they looked at energy intake and glycemic load based on the time of day. And energy intake and glycemic load in late morning was inversely associated with cardiovascular disease mortality. So, but if you were to eat late at night, so if you're one of those people that likes to go out for snack food or junk food or whatever it may be, in the middle of the night, you had up to 44% more cardiovascular disease mortality. So I always tell people to have a later breakfast and to eat dinner early. And an umbrella review in the +1 journal, vegetarian vegan diet significantly associated with better lipid profile, glycemic control, body weight, inflammation, and ischemic heart disease. No surprise. Mediterranean diet. And again, remember that the American take on a Mediterranean diet is not a real Mediterranean diet. A real Mediterranean diet is mostly plants. So be sure you get that, not lamb and feta, which a lot of people think is Mediterranean. And maybe it's part of a Mediterranean diet, but not solely. So in this interesting study of 25,000 women followed for 25 years, if you were able to follow a Mediterranean diet, you had a 23% reduced risk of all-cause mortality. So huge magnitude reductions, which are really not achievable with medications. And if you want to live longer, look at this model of 7 countries, but one's life expectancy can increase by up to 7 years, shifting to a vegan diet and eating a more whole grains, legumes, and drinking fewer sugar-sweetened beverages. How about for gout? Again, another inflammatory condition, 122,000 men and women. Pooled analysis, a healthy plant-based diet index was significantly inversely associated with less risk of gout, about 21%. But if you're a junk food plant-based eater, you had 17% more gout. So watch out for all the junk food. These days, we have solved for every food and baking issue that existed. You can find a plant-based version of virtually anything, but it doesn't mean that it's healthy for you. So this was a phenomenally interesting study. So this was 353,742 adults from Europe, 3 groups of genetically determined lifespan categories, long, intermediate, and short life, 3 lifestyle groups, favorable, intermediate, unfavorable, and participants with a genetic predisposition to a short lifespan and an unfavorable lifestyle had 200% more percent of death. An unfavorable lifestyle, 78% increased risk of death compared with a favorable lifestyle throughout these genetic categories. So what do the authors say? Adherence to a healthy lifestyle could largely attenuate the genetic risk of shorter lifespan or premature death. And the genetic risk of a shorter lifespan or premature death might be offset by a favorable lifestyle by approximately 62%, adding around 5 years to life. So your genes don't need to hold you hostage. So we're still in the era of COVID, as you may know. 702 participants provided information on sociodemographic characteristics. Omnivorous, plant-based. After adjusting for confounders such as body mass index, the plant-based diet group had 39% lower odds of COVID-19 infection. This was an interesting EPIC cohort, nearly 300,000 middle-aged participants. Each had a healthy lifestyle index score based on whether they smoked, alcohol, body mass, physical activity, the usual stuff. And then they estimated these associations in lifestyle-related cancers, including breast cancer, lung, colorectal, stomach, liver, cervix, esophagus, bladder, and others. And those in the bottom third at follow-up had 21% higher risk of lifestyle-related cancers. But among those that were at the bottom third at baseline, if they were at the top third at follow-up, 25% lower risk of lifestyle-related cancers. So what does that mean? Even if you are doing terribly with the way you live, it's never too late to make these changes because it improves outcomes always. So everyone asks me, Doc, can I drink? And the answer to this question is, well, I don't get to control that, you do. But what I would tell you is that the data that's out there is suggesting more and more now that what we thought might be safe might not be at all. And there was a linear relationship in this study of nearly 300,000 British participants between alcohol consumption and risk of premature death. And for each standard unit increase in alcohol, there was 30%, almost 30% more all-cause mortality, 30% cardiovascular disease, 20% risk of cancer, and 106% more digestive disease mortality. So maybe it's time to move to zero. So this was an interesting study, and maybe some of you listening will have the ability to affect this in your academic or institutional cafeterias. But if you set up a stationary cafeteria and you make the dish that can be ordered plant-based by default, the signage listed in both options. However, it listed the vegan dish first, followed by the meat dish, which was available upon request only. Only the vegan dish was displayed at the counter. The meat dish was kept in a separate location and retrieved when it was requested. It turns out you're able to reduce meat consumption by 57%, and the vegan meals are selected by 58% of the cafeteria stations who had the intervention. So it depends on what we present and what happens. Hang on one second here. Sorry about that.
I heard some dogs barking and it was making my dog bark. It was so funny.
Yes, well, somebody managed to push open the door. I don't know how they did it, but they keep getting smarter. All right, so, and then this was a really interesting one, diabetes and insulin resistance. So randomized control crossover study, 30 healthy adults were assigned either a 48-hour ad-lib diet, a vegan diet, or an omnivorous diet. And it turns out insulin concentrations and insulin resistance decline only after the vegan diet. But the thing that I found most fascinating about this is it was within 2 days. So people ask me, Doc, how quickly can I start seeing effects of making these dietary changes? It's pretty darn quick. Another interesting study of colorectal cancer. As you may know, we have some of the fastest growing rates of colorectal cancer among young people in the United States. Young onset patients had lower intake of vegetables and fruit, higher intake of processed meat and spicy food, which led to about 40% more odds of cancer. 5 Finnish cohorts, looking at nearly 50,000 participants. Diet was assessed and followed for nearly 30 years. If red meat was substituted with vegetables, you had a 3% reduction. Whole grains, vegetables, and fruits, 3% reduction. And for processed meat, 1% reduction. So the authors conclude that even small, easily implemented substitutions of red or processed meat with whole grains, vegetables, or fruits could lower colorectal cancer risk. So this is an interesting one, and a lot of people hear me talk about how important sleep is, and it turns out that in this group of people, after adjustment for demographics, education, smoking, all the usual things, if you look at how fragmented sleep was, those who had the most fragmented sleep had almost 3 times the odds of poor cognitive performance 10 years later. So do your best to get that 7 to 9 hours of uninterrupted sleep. That's really the sweet spot for the least amount of heart and probably cognitive disease as well. Another interesting study here, sleeping less than 7 hours a day had 7% more high blood pressure, and when it was less than 5 hours, 11% more. Now, this was pretty phenomenal because I deal with a lot of not only my colleagues, but many patients and family members who have different chronotypes, right? We have all the early birds out there and the night owls and all that. And it turns out that the extreme evening chronotype, the night owl, so to speak, was independently associated with an increased coronary artery calcium prevalence compared to the extreme morning type by 90%. So if you are an extreme evening, you had many more chances of having coronary artery calcium than those if you were an early bird. So get up early, eat right and exercise, and get to work and do good things in the world. How about this one? Nearly 410,000 men and women. Dietary fat intake was measured, and it turns out a greater intake of plant fat had up to 12% less cardiovascular disease, whereas animal fat, 16% more cardiovascular disease. Another study people always ask me, well, has there ever been a study of cow versus soy milk? And the answer is yes. 17 trials, meta-analysis, median daily dose of half a liter of soy milk, and it was substituted, and it turns out it drops blood pressure by 8 points, LDL by 3 points, and C-reactive protein drops pretty significantly, almost a whole point. So interestingly, people ask, are there flavors of Mediterranean diet? And we know from some of the prior work done in this space that the Mediterranean diet, when it's done in a vegetarian form, has better outcomes. And this was an interesting study of participants who had adhesion to the general patterns of the Mediterranean diet for 3 weeks and then changed to a same calorie vegan version for 4 weeks with a 7-day washout period between the diets. And it turns out that a change from the traditional to the vegan diet dropped total cholesterol by nearly 23 and LDL by 13. So again, big improvements simply just by making small changes. I'm always floored. I love reading The Week magazine because it gives me like the whole snapshot of news in just a couple of pages. And this was their last page. And they're talking about the lonely fight of the radical vegans, the tactics of vegan activists make a lot of people uncomfortable. And then the comment was, so should the plight of animals trapped in America's factory farms. And I thought that was a pretty powerful way in a mainstream non-medical journal to raise attention to knowing where your food comes from. You know, I oversee our service line at my institution, and I get this cardiovascular business digest, and I was surprised to see right after New Year's the top 15 heart healthy diets, and it turns out that most of them are plant-based, whether they're Mediterranean, DASH, Ornish, vegan, etc. Almost all of them are plant-based. And then for those of you that haven't been following along, we are in some serious trouble when it comes to climate. The UN chief said the world is on a quote-unquote highway to hell as planet endures 12 straight months of unprecedented heat. And it turns out that record-breaking temperatures were recorded across the globe in 2023. And without climate action, adverse climate-related health impacts are expected to worsen. And climate change is not a far in the future theoretical scenario. It is here and it kills. This was a very interesting study. So, you know, we in the medical professional are using cell phones pretty much all the time. And so is pretty much everybody else. And it turns out that if you follow nearly 500,000 people for 12 years, if you're a non-regular mobile phone user versus a regular mobile phone user, you had more cardiovascular disease by 4%. And it was amplified in people who were smokers and diabetics and heavy cell phone users. So cell phones may not be as safe as we're thinking. And there's lots of data that's out there that's very interesting. I encourage you to take a peek and see what you think. And of course, what's good for you is good for the planet. In this interesting study, again, following from the usual cohorts, nurses, health, and health professionals follow-up study, they looked at a plant-based healthy dietary index, and it was calculated and compared with the highest and the lowest, 33% less all-cause mortality, 14% lower risk of death from cardiovascular disease, and if you jump down, 47% lower risk of death from respiratory diseases and 28% from neurodegenerative disease. So again, it seems like across whatever specialty or disease spectrum you know, people really do better when they eat plant-based. So I love this. This was the evolving role of doctors in the 21st century out of the European Heart Journal. And what they say is that the global phenomenon of an aging population compounded by the pervasive pandemic of abdominal obesity and metabolic diseases stemming from unhealthy lifestyles is a formidable challenge. And simply increasing spending is not a viable solution. So there's an urgent need to transition towards preventative healthcare educational models rather than predominantly addressing chronic conditions reactively within hospital settings. I thought this was very well worded, and I wish this would become the mantra for all of healthcare that we apply. And then there was an interesting, the New England Journal of Medicine, as you may know, is the #1 medical journal in the United States, really well respected. They had a whole thing on diets. And what was the conclusion? It said, although many diets have been developed with an initial aim of controlling body weight, dietary composition has important health effects that are independent of the effects on adiposity. And an overall inspection of the literature suggests that plant-based diets with moderate lipid content, characterized by the usual consumption of good things, has substantial health benefits. So educating health professionals about diets and the potential effects of these diets on diseases is imperative. And advice on healthy eating should be incorporated into clinical practice taught in medical curricula. And I had the privilege of working with my colleagues on writing this lovely paper, Food is Medicine, the Time is Now. And we talked a lot about how every professional society now endorses this plant-forward diet, but we really need to implement it and arm our clinicians with tools that allow them to do this. So again, a really nice way to end. And so bottom line, after seeing all of this, I hope you'll agree that success looks like a low-fat, 100% whole grain, minimally processed, whole food, plant-based diet. And Albert Einstein, I love closing with this: nothing will benefit human health and increase our chances of survival for life on Earth as much as the evolution to a vegetarian diet. And then if you're not convinced or if you need some extra support, you can always walk with a doc. It's a national program. This is our program. Come join us. And then we have a transitioning to plant-based support group, which is virtual, and it's open to all of you. So just check it out. It's on the National Jewish webpage. The web site is below. Great way to get the support you need to make the changes you're looking to do. And if you're not convinced, I always encourage people, spend the time to do your own research, read some great books, watch some documentaries, get inspired, and use the knowledge to improve your health and outcomes. And with that, I've left a few minutes for questions.
Oh, thank you. That is an amazing talk. It must take you a long time to read all that research and put it together.
It totally does.
That is crazy. So you mentioned Dean Ornish, your good friend. Did you run one of his programs, or is that what you're running in your hospital now, is like an Ornish program?
Yeah, we did for a while. It was the intensive cardiac rehab program that he has put together and has really great outcomes. But hospital systems right now are under enormous financial stress. And so a lot of things aren't as supported as they were. But we did run it for probably about 7 or 8 years. And our traditional cardiac rehab program incorporates many of the same ideals, just not in as an intensive way.
Because then I would ask, because one of your slides, you're probably going to know what I'm going to ask when you talked about olive oil. Is that part of the Ornish program now? And how much oil are we talking about? Because that seems to be one of the biggest controversies in the plant-based world right now.
It is, yes. And I always tell people I'd rather focus on people changing the way they eat on a regular basis and cutting out all of the processed gobbledygook and animal-based foods. But the truth is, oil is controversial. So for many of my patients, and especially if you're following Ornish, it's really a very low-fat diet. And so what I usually tell people is that if you're able to swap out, say, oil for like veggie broth, if you're sauteing, or if you're able to cut out oils are very caloric. They're one of the most caloric foods we consume. And then depending on how they're prepared, many of them have been stripped of their antioxidant properties. Olive oil is probably the safest of the lot, but again, it's highly caloric. And there's those people who have very high risk or have had repeated cardiac events. I often tell them to cut out oil as much as they possibly can or get it down to zero. There is some limited evidence suggesting, at least in the bench, that olive oil and other oils, high oil contents, may interrupt the function of endothelial cells, which line the blood vessels. So again, in general, everything I recommend is always low fat. But the problem is that if you look at many of these olive oil studies, people are consuming large quantities. I think a teaspoon here and there is probably not a bad thing if you can tolerate it. And if you're looking to cut weight, however, I try to avoid it as much as you can.
But okay, so I had pancreatitis, and I don't think my pancreas is ever going to be normal again. I eat a little oil and I'm in like terrible pain. But I'm curious, like, how do you eat olive oil and still keep your diet low fat? We're talking minuscule amounts, aren't we?
Yes. So again, a teaspoon of olive oil is not very much at all, right? I mean, if you look at if you watch a commercial kitchen, or if you go to a fancy restaurant, they're using olive oil or other oils, canola, sunflower, safflower, etc. If you look at the amounts they're using, it's mind blowing.
It's
I'm talking
egregious,
about a few
actually.
drops and
Yeah.
they're, coating it. So I usually tell people, very low fat means truly as little as possible. And not everyone understands that. But when you're dousing your vegetables in oil, it's too much.
But is there anything that you get from olive oil or any oil that you can't get from the whole plant? So, in other words,
Oh,
is there something magical about the olive oil that I couldn't just get by eating an olive, for example?
no, right. So I always tell people that the best way to get anything, remember the vast majority of oils require high heat and pressure to extract oils. And what I always tell people is, when you take a teeny tiny seed like a canola or a sunflower or safflower or whatever it is, you try to get oil out of it. It is not an easy process. Olives are a little bit different, but if you're eating the foods in the matrix that nature intended, there's usually a lot less harm. And so, yes, you absolutely could do that. But some people would argue that in order to make their vegetables and foods more palatable, they want a little oil. I think there are ways, very clever and creative ways that I'm sure you as a chef could elaborate on better than I could, that would make foods just as palatable without the
Oh
oil.
my gosh, there's air fryers, there's balsamic vinegar and Dijon. I mean, that's crazy. I think food tastes worse with oil because it coats the taste buds of your tongue, and then you've got to start using a lot more salt.
Agreed. And to your point, growing up, I thought Brussels sprouts were disgusting. And then when I've figured out how to air fry them and put a good balsamic on, I can't believe how good they are.
I know they're like candy, right?
I
Yeah.
know who would have known, right?
Ooh.
So, but so again, I would say this: I would rather not sort of fight or spend a lot of time about how much oil is too much and all this. In general, low fat's low fat. If you're at your highest risk, I'd cut it down. But for the vast majority of Americans, we're not having this debate. We're trying to get them away from fast food and
Right.
chips and candies and whatnot on a regular basis. So I always tell people, yes, there are some interesting debates and controversies in the plant-based world, but the bigger hill is not that. It's really getting rid of all the junk that's everywhere.
Absolutely. And I would agree 100%. Sometimes people have to do it in stages. I thought that was really interesting. One of your slides, it said a person can be overweight or obese and still suffer from malnutrition.
It's true. Actually, it's surprising to learn, but if you're subsisting on highly processed foods and candies and chips and whatever else may be, you may not be getting all of the nutrients you might need. And it turns out that we can actually do blood and other biomarkers and figure out that some of these people are actually missing a number of things. So in general, you can't make an assumption when someone is big that they are well nourished. They may not be.
Right. Thank you. So this, I mean, this is amazing that a question came in through our help desk, and my VA, Linda, just texted it to me, and it's like life imitates art because I mentioned it to you briefly before we logged on, and I had mentioned to you that recently I was in the emergency room with chest pain, but it wasn't a heart attack. What do you think it was? You guessed it immediately, but apparently I'm not the only one that has this problem. So Morgan said, like AJ, I landed in the ER with shooting pain in my left upper rib cage, and after a complete cardiac workup that produced unremarkable results, I was diagnosed with costochondritis. Dr. Freeman, can you please explain what it is, what makes some people experience this, and if I should be concerned? I'm a 48-year-old postmenopausal woman who has been plant-based for 8 years.
Yeah, I mean, so, when people come to me as a cardiologist with chest pain, right, we always tell people they're sort of quote unquote guilty until proven innocent, and that we're trying to make sure that they don't die from a cardiac cause. So when you show up in an emergency room with chest pain, that's one of the higher acuity items. And so the ER doctor, whoever's seeing you, is trying to exclude that you have life-threatening conditions. So they're going to do things like exclude that you're having a heart attack. They'll probably image your chest and rule out a blood clot in your lungs. They'll probably make sure there's no tears in your major blood vessels, that kind of thing. And they'll probably run a whole bunch of blood work on you. Costochondritis is just inflammation of the rib cage. And believe it or not, most of us, if you work out ever with weights and you're pressing and doing whatever, your muscles can be sore. And if you really overdo it, you could actually get some of the connective tissue between some of the ribs and the bones to get sore. Some people like feeling sore. And of course, in some people, the soreness is so intense that it mimics life-threatening conditions. So if you ever go to an ER with chest pain, no matter how old you are, you'll probably be excluded from the things I just mentioned. And then they'll say, well, we don't know what the cause is. It could be this, this, or this. And costochondritis is more of a diagnosis of exclusion. What I usually tell people is if you're one of those people that's susceptible to it, good stretching, massage, sometimes dry needling, topical arnica gel, if you're not pregnant, is always a plus. So try some of those things and see.
But if like me, if you've never had it, never been diagnosed with it, you don't know. And I'm on Keytruda, and Keytruda can actually amp up inflammation everywhere in your body.
Right. Yeah. And again, you have to be particularly, you may not realize, like, I had a patient once who, moved and lifted a whole bunch of boxes like 2 days prior and then showed up in the ER with chest pain. And it sure as hell looked like they were having a heart attack. And then we did all the testing, it was negative. And then you were able to kind of reproduce where some of the pain was. And he's like, oh, yeah, I was doing this or that or whatever it was with boxes. So, um, bottom line is, I always tell people it's probably worth crying wolf since heart disease is the number one killer. But be forewarned, if it's not your heart and it's not anything life-threatening, it could be costochondritis.
Right. So if it ever happens again, we don't keep going every time, right?
Well, so what I always tell people is it's important to know the warning symptoms. So when you have symptoms that occur above the waist, chest pain, tightness, squeezing, burning, whatever it may be, and you have associated shortness of breath, or these things come on worse with activity and resolve when you rest, those would be signs that make me concerned it's your heart.
Got it. When do you start working on the Urine Plans 2026, and when does that get released?
So I usually start working on it probably in November-ish, maybe depends on when I have time. And then I kind of, every few days when I can, I try to go through as many of the studies and data that I have and try to develop a new deck. And every year I've been doing it. It's a labor of love. It's a lot of fun, but it's a lot of work and exciting.
How long have you been doing this?
Gosh, probably at least a decade, maybe a little more. So I
Nice.
have, lots and lots of decks of really eye-opening data. And if only, the powers that be in the world would pay attention.
Well, I'm going to pay attention, and I'm going to talk to the producer in Vegas to see if he'll have you do 2026 next year, because it's so cool that you do a different talk. Then you can be hired every year because it's a different talk.
That's exactly right. A lot of people in the plant-based space have amazing specialties and they have similar talks, which are great. And sometimes they update them as they're doing more research or more work. But the nice thing about this particular talk that I give, and I have a variety of them, is it's eye-opening because it changes every single year.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, do you see patients virtually, or can you only see people that live in the state of Colorado?
So I can see people virtually or in person in the state. I'm not licensed in other states. So there is another service that's, I think, in your web link that does a non-medical consultation, meaning that it's not a medical consultation in the usual way, but happy to talk with folks about whatever it is they like to talk about in their particular situations and their data, and make suggestions that are not like a legal medical visit, so to speak.
Nice. Well, that information is in the show notes. And Morgan, who asked the question in advance, she's watching live. She says, thank you. Not that anybody wants a heart attack, but after they do all that stuff, I just felt like, oh my God, I wasted all your time. And, I felt terrible that it wasn't something serious. Do you know what I mean? Like, I was like, oh,
No, and you should never feel that way. So what I would tell you is this. Again, if heart disease was super rare, sure, maybe you wasted people's time, but it's not. And
right.
until we get to the Star Trek where I can wave my little wand on you and figure out what's going on, especially if you are an older American, so if you're over, say, 60 or even 50 in the United States, and you're getting chest pain that makes you worried, I'd rather you cry wolf than not.
Right. Yeah. I wish there was like an intermediate place that's like, because urgent care won't take you with chest pain. But I will say one good thing about going to the ER with chest pain, you get in pretty quick.
You do. Yeah, your workup is done quickly. And that's a very good point. So let me explain that urgent cares are not designed for the potential of a catastrophic event. So if you have crushing chest pain, if you can't breathe well, I'd probably recommend skipping an urgent care unless that's all you have nearby.
Yeah. Well, I was really lucky. There was only two ahead of me. There was a trauma and there was a stroke, and I was number three. And I mean, I was in and out in 4 hours, and 4 hours is pretty good.
No doubt. And I could say you could even do it quicker, believe it or not. I mean, these days we have some wonderful CT angiograms we can do. We have some very rapid turnaround time blood tests. It could be even quicker in some cases. But yes, most people expect to spend somewhere between 4 to 10 hours in an ER. And I think we're getting better every year at getting people through more quickly, especially with high acuity disease.
It's my least favorite thing to do, followed by the dentist. But
No, I
Dr.
don't think
Freeman,
anyone wants to go to the emergency room.
no, no, we don't. But Dr. Freeman, thank you so much for your work. And I really hope to see you in person. I haven't seen you in person since a long time ago in Colorado at Kelly Williamson's conferences. I don't think she's doing them anymore, but I'm going to put out there that next year you will be in Vegas giving the 2026 talk.
I would love it. Thank you so much.
I
And great
would
to be
love
here
it
as
too. Thank
always.
you so much, Dr. Freeman, and thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ and Friends. I'll be going to Vegas tomorrow, so there is not going to be a show. I don't even know when we're going to have another show. When am I coming back? Oh boy, it could be a while. Oh, I don't know. The 10th, I think, September 10th.